As foreign language students, we all know that to communicate with others in a foreign language is really challenging, and this is more difficult when we have not yet mastered the language with the proficiency level we need in order to feel confident. Well, there are many other aspects that can impact in the way foreign language students communicate in the classroom, where the main target is precisely to express ourselves in the second language. Those aspects could vary from one person to the other. However, there are certain identified variables which impact the way in which foreign languages students communicate in the second language they are learning. There are more than linguistic aspects involved in this process. Those variables are associated to the concept of willingness to communicate. So, well, let's see. According to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, the term willing means that a person is inclined or favorably disposed in mind to do something, that the person is ready or prompt to act or to respond. This is an important term for us in order to understand the willingness to communicating. What does willingness to communicate mean? Well, according to Peter McIntyre, in this book, Willingness to Communicate in the Second Language, Understanding the Decision to Speak as a Volitional Process, this concept of willing to communicate can be defined as the probability of speaking when free to do so. Second language students usually study the second language they have chosen in order to communicate. However, when they have the possibility to use this language in the classroom, many of them choose not to use it. They choose not to speak. On the contrary, others choose to speak. This is a real situation in the classroom, and that is why some researchers have tried to understand this phenomenon that they have defined as the willingness to communicate. The first studies about the willingness to communicate started in the domain of the first language linguistic. The following studies try to explain this concept as the result of a personality trait. The concept was studied because researchers were interested at first on the students' unwillingness to communicate. Then, the studies turned to study students' motivation as the explanation of this unwillingness. Finally, the concept was redefined by McIntyre as a complex phenomenon and the result of an interplay of numerous factors. Moreover, McIntyre studied this phenomenon, and he did it for the context of the second language learning process. He said that those factors could influence negatively or positively the willingness to communicate of students. And he defined this term as a state of readiness to enter a discourse at a particular time with a specific person or persons using a second language. This researcher believes that willing to communicate represents their willingness to speak freely without fear. So, as we can see, the degree of willingness to communicate depends on different aspects as the context in which students are, the receivers of the message, and the personality traits of the students, and those aspects determine whether individuals choose to speak or avoid having conversation. In the article Willingness to Communicate in the Second Language, Understanding the Decision to Speak as a Volitional Process, McIntyre explains again this concept by associating it with the two precedent concepts researchers analyzed in order to define the student's competence of speaking. So he mentioned two concepts, language anxiety and motivation. As the previous approaches to the notion he defined as willingness to communicate, he says that many students could experience language anxiety, which is a negative emotional reaction that could affect their willingness to communicate. But on the other hand, motivation has been considered as a dominant aspect too in this field for years. He explains that beyond those two concepts, which previously tried to describe this process, there are more factors involved, so he integrated all in a pyramid that shows the different factors could play a role in students when they communicate in a second language. So, as I have already said, in order to better understand the aspect involved in the willingness to communicate, McIntyre, Clement, Dorney, and Knowles organized in a pyramid the factors they talk about, in which we can see that those factors could belong to different fields. And this pyramid combined psychological, linguistic, and communicative aspects, and they could be individual, social, or situational. In this pyramid, we can see the different levels of the factors involved. In this pyramid, we can see the different variables affecting the willingness to communicate in a second language. This pyramid consists of 6 layers, which show the importance of the variables in the process. We can see, for example, that at the top of the pyramid, we have the ultimate objective of the process, which is the second language use. And then we can also note that to get to that level, to the level of willingness to communicate, we have to have already the other variables at the bottom of the pyramid. At the bottom of the pyramid, we can see the variables which are more difficult to change because they are influenced by others, by context, or by the genetic traits of the individual. Then, we can also see that variables to the left of the pyramid are more related to the group interaction, and the variables on the right of the pyramid are more related to the individual psychological or aspect of the student. By following the layers order from the bottom to the top of the pyramid, we can understand that in the 7th layer, for example, the social and individual context play an indirect but powerful role because the students cannot influence on them. On layer 5, the affective cognitive context, in this layer, the student sets the basis to approach the target language. Well, according to Jean-Marc Dewey and Olivia Dewey, in their article Learner Internal and Learner External Predictors of Willingness to Communicate in the Classroom, the 5th layer could be shaped at school and in the classroom. Then, in layer 4th, there is a transition from the most stable context to a context where the variables are defined by the personal motives and expectations of the student. At layer third, the situated antecedents are conformed by the desire to communicate and also by the perception of the self. We can see here again this interaction between the groupal and the individual aspect. In layer 2, we see finally the willingness to communicate that according to Delane Dewell represents the final psychological step in preparation for communication, which will be a reality in the layer number 1. We have also to notice that this is not as simple as is it organized in the pyramid, because inside every variable there are multiple factors to take into account. So why is this important for us? Well, after talking about the willingness to communicate and the pyramid, which explains this phenomenon, we can see that the most evident situation presented by the fact of students talking or not in our classroom is what we see. But what hides behind that behavior, that action, is extremely complex and not evident at all. The knowledge about this phenomenon is relevant for the learning process of students, but also for the teaching process, which can precisely focus on the use of those variables to enhance the student willingness to communicate.